All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Was running a little late there, so I wanted to give everybody a minute to kind of catch up. Let's get out of Twittersville here. So what do we have here? So yeah, earlier this morning, I had a couple different things this week that I was, I guess, working on, and I wasn't super happy with, and wanted to kind of clean up. So just to kind of revisit these for a second. Um, Deeply nested code was probably the nastiest one, so I'm kind of glad that got the most votes. So that's what we're going to end up looking at today. But just for future reference, and we'll see this here in the fixer, the unresourceful routes. This is kind of Laravel specific, but it's basically there's 7 resourceful actions. I have a couple controllers that don't strictly follow that. I've been trying to strictly follow that for the last year or so, and I just think it's good practice. It really kind of challenges you to think of your controllers and your actions, excuse me, and your endpoints in kind of a really clean way. So um, that's something I want to do eventually. So for future, if you see that pop up as a poll, that's what that is. And then of course, there's, like I said in the very beginning of all this, I don't have a lot of test coverage on Shift and some of the pieces. I kind of have I guess the core functionality, the payment and so forth is all good to go. But some of the stuff in the engine, the actual Shift bot that does the automation, and some of the like in between pieces inside of Shift, like the dashboard and stuff, they don't have test coverage. And like I said, it's a little bit embarrassing, but it's also reality of the situation. I'm adding a lot of new features all the time, and I'm trying to now implement a policy where I write tests for those. So there's always the opportunity to go in and write tests for something that doesn't have tests. So that's a possible future refactor idea too. So if you see this poll again, that's what these other two are. They might squeak back on the list if I don't clean them up kind of on my own. So thanks for all those that voted. And hopefully we got a few people in here now while I chit-chatted. Feel free to use the comments and so forth. There's a little bit of delay I've learned with YouTube. Not a little bit. There's like a 1 minute delay. So just send them across as you have them, and I'll address them either at the end or more likely during. So, okay, so the piece of code I want to focus on today, let's look at kind of the end result of that so we can see how that plays out. And then I'll look at the code that kind of, a piece of the code that's a lot of nested code that solves this. So the Laravel fixer is something I've really been working on. It's one of the shifts that are available kind of outside of the standard upgrade shifts. I call them micro shifts. And it's got some pretty cool stuff in here. And these two actually are kind of, I guess, in my opinion, the latest, greatest kind of cool things to it. And these came out of like my own personal itch, I kind of wanted to scratch. And let's take a look at these two, because they both kind of do the same thing, and I'm going to focus on one of them today because it has kind of a lot of nested code. So this shift to consistent fluent response chains and fluent route methods, this is all opportunity here to kind of clean up different things. So for example, inside like a route, very basic, you just have a get route and then like a functional closer here to basically return a view. And there's actually like more fluent ways to write that with this route view. There's other things inside of here they might not have popped up. This is all view stuff, but here's some better examples. Route group with like these array of options for middleware auth. It actually chains on the middleware auth and then the group closure. So it just kind of cleans it up and makes things a bit more fluent, but also does opportunities where it can clean things up and use kind of native functionality like this view helper. So I think that's really cool, especially for the routes. That's something I spent a lot of time on. But it's one of those things where this code is kind of broken up a little bit, but where I actually go in and start to do the replacements is a lot of kind of if-else nested for each stuff. So another one is this response chain. Same thing, same concept. It just kind of goes in and looks for returns and sees if there's an opportunity to maybe clean this up a little bit. So just starts things with redirect, a response. So again, it's just a little more fluent, it's a little more readable. I like these chains personally. Again, you can turn these off in Shift. You don't have to adopt this fluent kind of chain, but this is what the code does, is the point. So it just goes in for opportunities and looks for ways to kind of clean this up. So here's another really nice one, response like null for the content in 204. Well, there's a no content actually built into the framework. So that's just a lot more expressive, very Laravel, artisan kind of way. So anyway, this is what the code ultimately end result does. But to get there takes a lot of nested code. And the piece I really want to focus on probably is really this section. So this is about 100 lines, and it's not complex per se. Maybe this central block is, and maybe that's the part we'll focus on the most. So the central block is pretty complex. Like I check to see, okay, are you the content argument or a status argument or the header argument, and then there's logic within that to determine, okay, well, did you use some kind of internal helper, or are you basically a string value? And are you a string value that even matters, or can you be ignored? So there's a lot of kind of trickling down, kind of fall through, kind of branching logic that's happening here. And again, it's not hard to, I guess, work through. It's very, I don't want to use the word procedural, but I mean it is kind of procedural. It's very linear, right? It's very sequential, and so. But the point is there's a lot of things to kind of keep track of. There's all these temp variables. That kind of get used down here to turn into something else. And it would be nice if there was just a better way to kind of express this. So I was thinking, okay, well, there's a couple different options. I guess taking a step back. A lot of time when I come across nested code, I try to implement some of the practices that I put in base code. So there's a whole chapter on nested code for those that aren't familiar, just kind of a shameless plug. It's an ebook that I provided, or I call it a field guide because it's supposed to be very practical, very real world. But anyways, one of the chapters is nested code. Chapter 3, in fact, is nested code. And chapter 4, which we'll kind of trickle into a little bit, is using objects. So the combination of the two really focus on ways to kind of clean up code like this. And in some cases, in really easy cases, you can introduce a guard clause, or you can wrap things in like these helping methods or whatever to kind of clean it up. But what's interesting about this code is we could start to apply that, but I think there's a way to bridge it with something else, and that's kind of why I was saying this chapter for using objects is going to come into play a little bit. When I really look through this code, yes, it's a bunch of nested code, but you have to take a step back. I don't want to get too focused on the nested code, because I could focus on that and probably clean this up to be a little more readable. I could break this off into some other method to be like, some kind of, I don't know, like content equals, grab content or something, right? Or extract content, whatever that might be, right? And I pass it in, the argument. And that's one way to do it. And that might break it up to where it's a little bit cleaner. And I could, some people might say, okay, well, let's make this a switch, and we'll switch it on the argument name. And, if it's basically, if the case is content, I'll do this bit, right? And then I'll just break out of that, or I can just straight continue because there's nothing else to do. And then, the case is, the case is what was one of the other ones? Status. And just kind of do the same thing. I would set status, and you start to get the idea, like status equals, extract status. And this would really start to push you in that direction. So this is a good start. But ultimately, what the direction really is here in my mind is, again, if we go even farther back than just the nested code, if we start to say, okay, well, what is this nested code doing? Well, basically what it's doing is if we go back to kind of the original code, basically what it's doing is it's looking inside of here and pulling out each one of those arguments or parameters and kind of assigning them, right, the values. So the parameter is content, status, and header. That's the parameter order. And then whatever the person passes in is basically what I'm trying to set these temporary variables to. So, and they've all been parsed out with static analysis and so forth. So it's pretty reliable, like what's coming out of there. But now I have to do a little bit of like developer interpretation of like, okay, well, what did you really mean here? And is it a value that can be, done a different way, right? Written in one of these fluent ways. And that's where really the kind of interesting logic starts to happen. But in order to get there and kind of write this very quickly, again, as you've seen before in some of these refactors, like I try not to get caught up in anything right away. I just try to kind of get something down. Like I really try to just have the code, you know, work, right? Like I'm not too worried about it being pretty in the beginning. I'm really attacking it. I'm dividing and conquering. I'm getting pieces to work. I might not have this no content to work. Maybe I just have, the simple stuff like redirect, but I gain momentum is the point. And that's just kind of some insight into the way in which I try to write some of this stuff. So that's why it turns out this way, and I don't beat myself up over it. I think some developers end up getting stuck on like, oh man, I don't want to make a for each loop. Like I want to make this a collection method or something. And maybe I'll get there, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Like that's a good idea. But I don't worry about getting there like right away. I worry more about solving the problem first. So I solved the problem. It's out there. It's been working. I've, seen the debugging from, dozens of shifts since this has been released. I've tested it on all my projects. I've tested it, of course, with some sample stuff, some contrived examples. And there's some tweaks to do here or there, but right now I want to focus again on this, huge block. So let's reset this. Let's start getting to work here. So let's do get status. And I'm pretty sure I don't have anything here. Yeah, okay, so let's just do a get reset dash dash hard because that's just the changes I made. And let's do a get clean dash FD because I don't need those things. And then get checkout dash B refactor nested code is what we'll call this. All right, cool. We are in a clean place to be working that I can finish this up on later on. So let's focus kind of on this and get that momentum where everyone can kind of see where I think we'll go with this. We'll get some tests written, of course, get some more test coverage here. That'd be great. And then, like I said, I'll probably finish it up off screen. But let's get the direction going. So let me pause for questions and some more drink. I see some Bernardo. Maybe make the title. Yeah, you're right. I need to set up the live stream where it publishes to the same URL each time. So that way I can post it a little earlier and I'm not kind of scrambling and delaying. Because what ends up happening is I record like 5 minutes of just puttering around and then I edit it on YouTube later. But for YouTube to swap out the video takes like 4 or 5 hours. It's crazy. So it's kind of annoying because right when everyone's watching it, there's like 5 minutes of cruft to get through. So it's a little bit annoying. So yes, you're absolutely right. I will do better titles and a more consistent URL so I can just jump right in and start live streaming in the future. So good suggestion. Any questions on the code though, send them across. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with a test. So I do have tests for not PHP unit. I do have tests for Shift. What do we have here? We have 176 of them, 232 assertions. So by no means is it completely covered, but is it mostly covered? Yes. There's some good stuff in here, but this particular bit, short of some high-level tests, doesn't really have anything. So let's take the opportunity to kind of break this back down to a unit level and drive this out into something else. So earlier I alluded to the game plan here, and the game plan here is ultimately pretty much from here down to, probably right around here. I want these lines, what is this, 42 lines? I want these lines of like 42, 50 lines of code. Sorry, my mouse is being like really jittery today. I want those like, 40 or 50 lines of just nested code, temporary variables, for each loops. I'd really like to tackle this and see if I can make it, not necessarily less code, but more approachable code, unnested is the most important piece. So I'm really going to focus in on this inner block first, and then we'll kind of work out from there and see what we're afforded with our new, game plan. So let's do this. Let's bring up a test. All right, so let's go to test, PHP unit. And this will probably, for now, I'm just going to call it a model. It's not a model in a traditional sense of Laravel, like as far as interacting with a database, but it is something that holds data. It's a data element. It's an entity, if you will. And, again, I don't really get caught up right away with the naming or whatnot. So that's where I'm going to put it for now. And I may move this later to a mapper, or I might make an entity or a DTO or whatever weird words people like to use in the programming world. But for now, let's get moving. And what I'm going to do is basically just call this, this is basically the response. It's like a response parameter object. It's not really a parameter object. It's kind of like the parameter list. I don't really know. Let's just call it response for now, though. It's not entirely accurate, but it's close enough. And what do we have here? We're just a straight test case. I'm not wrapping anything else. So let's extends test case. And we're not a shift test case. We're a PHP unit framework test case. There we are. Let's clean all this up. So many line breaks. And let's write our first test. So public function test. And I don't really know what it is yet, so I just want to make sure this is running. So in fact, we've written enough here. This will run. So vendor bin PHP unit. Let's see. And then what do we call that? We call that test models PHP unit models response. Cool. Okay, so it's running. It's warning there are no tests found. Okay, so we have our test case. I'm going to break that off. I'm going to close this back up. And we need an actual response object here, but let's not go there just yet. So ideally, what I would like, and this is kind of another strategy that I use, what I would really like is just kind of pseudocode this out and write the API that I want. And so what I'd really like to do here is, if we look at what all this if-else does, it's basically determining what should be held and like what argument should be kind of saved and stored. So it's really breaking out content, status, and headers. It's not doing anything else. In fact, the only thing this is doing inside of here is just kind of doing some string replacement to kind of clean up those different arguments that are those argument values that are being passed in. But otherwise, it's just building up kind of this response object that I want to do more things with. So most of this code can actually go away. So really, this ends up kind of just being nothing is the goal. Because if I turn this into some kind of value object that I can do things with and just call and say, okay, what are you? Then that's actually what I want. So ideally, we would call response with arguments and basically set that up. But that's a little bit ugly because now it's not really like a low-level object. Let me just write a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and jump the gun just a bit and make this response model just so we can kind of hack out. I can kind of demonstrate what I'm after. So let's do a new PHP class. I'm going to call this response. Oh, there we go. All right, and let's close that down. Okay, so here's our response. So ideally what I'd like is inside of here, I would just have a private content. I would have this private status, and I would have like private headers. And I might just, whoops, not $private. And just for giggles, let's kind of set these so we can get some pairing with what is over here kind of on the left, right? So ideally this response object holds kind of the low level bit, and it's really like response parameters. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to response parameters just to get a little closer. And again, I don't get caught up in the names. I kind of just keep refactoring. That's so simple with something like PHP Storm or whatever your IDE is to properly change those. So, you know, as I kind of work on something and use it more and more, I get to a place where, you know, that name starts to become apparent. So we'll probably change it again and again. But the point is, I'm just cleaning it up a little bit along the way as I kind of feel there's a better name. So, okay, so ideally what I want is this. And the problem is that if I just kind of took this out of here, I would basically have to make something, you know, I'd have to say like new response, and then I'd pass it in like all the arguments. And I don't want to really do that because then all I'm doing is taking, you know, this, or sorry, I'm really just taking like this for each and all this if else stuff and breaking it off into like another place, like a constructor or something, which isn't terrible, but my goal here is not to make like, design pattern bingo. Like I don't want to play design pattern bingo. I don't want to, make a factory that that parses this stuff and then maps it to this low-level object. So I'm trying to take just a second here and think, what's a reasonable way I can pass this in? Or do I just continue to kind of like set the content? Do I just build up this response object in here, right? So maybe I just say something like response, set content or something along those lines. So it's kind of like what we had earlier, but I'm getting an object out of it instead of just all these temporary variables. So that is something. I'm not a huge fan of making an object like out of thin air with no properties on it. But you know what? Again, I don't like to get stuck. So let's just play this out for a second. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm not gonna test getters and setters. That's pretty straightforward. So let's actually continue to spike for a minute. So what I do want to do is make sure that I have all the proper naming now that I changed this again. So, and then on top of which that should be response parameter test anyways. There we go. All right, cool. And let's actually get some code going here. So let's spike this out the way we were talking about. So let's do this. Let's side by side, kind of like we saw last time, let's make a response parameters object here. And let's make a response parameters. And whoops, and there it is. All right, and then down here, alongside this, I'm basically just going to do response parameters set content. All right, and we're going to pass it in. What are we passing it in? We know that it's the content already, so we really just need this argument value. Okay. So if we did this, let's make this. All right. And what we would end up doing, again, I'm just spiking here. This isn't 100%. But what we would do here is we basically steal that and bring it over here. Now, I don't really like that 100% just yet. But let's play it out and see how it looks for the rest of these. Okay, so I would do something like that, and we can already see we're kind of just like that switch statement we saw a little bit ago. I would do one, for set status here. Set status, and I might not end up keeping all those, but and then we do another one for response parameters set header, and then we pass in the argument, and let's generate these two. That way we have a place to put our code, and let's generate another one. All right, and so let me paste that in there and paste that in there. And again, this isn't necessarily functional, but I'm just trying to get a feel for what does this look like? Like, how does it feel, right? So it kind of just feels, honestly, it feels a little bit like a trade-off. What I don't like is that now, and the goal was to really end up tracking all these, but I think it's going to be a bit difficult to kind of set these one by one, right? I think a factory would be a little bit cleaner, but I don't really want to write all that just yet because I feel like that's going to take longer than what I want to do this little video for. I don't want to have people watch like a 2-hour live stream where I pedal through something. So I think the ultimate goal is to have this set content, set status, and so forth. So let's play this out just for a second and keep on going. So let's move away from this code because right now it's a 1-for-1 replacement provided this actually returns, kind of what we want it to return. And of course we would need some getters down here. So let's continue on with this. I'm going to close these. And let's kind of continue spiking so we can see what this looks like because I don't have tests for this code right here. It's just kind of, there's some integration tests, but it's not like, we're not really going to be able to see that I swapped this out. So what I want to do is just go ahead and play this out for kind of like using this response parameters. Let's write the code that would exist, and then that way we can focus strictly on making this response parameters class through tests work the way we would expect. So, so maybe here I can do something like if response parameters is empty, right? And let's just stick with the old Java stuff since I've got set and so forth. Again, I might change these later. So we're going to need an is empty, and I'll continue to add these methods because that way I'll know kind of what I need to drive out. So if the response parameters is empty, then we know that we can continue on. There's nothing to do. And then what we can do here is we could get a little more crafty with these. So instead of like all these temporary variables, we could just do something like response parameters using uses view method or something like that. Uses view method. But the point here is that it's actually giving us a place to it's giving us a place to basically house a lot of this if-else stuff that we have going on everywhere, right? And so we know now if we're using a view method, then we want to keep all the string kind of replacement stuff here, but we don't really want to do anything else, because like all this should really be handled elsewhere. Like the chaining and so forth is probably appropriate, but the rest of the stuff like is not. So let's pull this chain out, because all these arguments and status and so forth, they should all live inside of this response parameters. So this is probably, I'm going to put a little to-do tag here because that's not one for one. This is actually only if there's a status. Or sorry, that was if. See, look at this. All this nested code's already thrown me off. So we have this replacement. Yeah, that's actually not one for one. Let's steal this inner bit and backtrack a second. So really, we have a double nested bit here, and replacement's already up there, and then this chain lived inside of here. So again, not fully unnested just yet. It'd be nice if we could get that in there. We'll come back to it though. And then basically we can say something like, response has content. And ideally, I would get rid of all of these methods because I don't really want all these. Ideally, I could just ask this response parameters for the content, and it's either going to give me something or it's going to give me nothing. So, hopefully, again, these inner ifs can all be broken out. But for now, maybe here I could do something like, instead of testing these directly, I could say something like response parameters can or is no content or something like that. So yeah, so we can keep going from here. So we can basically say response parameters, has status, and then we know that we're going to do a status code here, and basically has headers. So we see here that we turn this like into a very, very simple object. So, and we'll drive some of the tests out on these, but let's do this. Let's add these methods, and let's go on down to the next one, just so I have this shell, and then we'll drive some of these out with tests, and we'll kind of just call it there. All right, cool. So these are pretty straightforward. And again, there's more to clean up over here, but the point is that, first of all, I've improved, if nothing else, I've improved the readability. I haven't gotten rid of all the nested code, but I think as I start to drive this out with tests, it's going to be very easy to collapse this, again, once we get that momentum. So I don't want to spend, I think I've already spent more than enough time, in my opinion, on pulling these, kind of thinking this through ahead of time. Like, normally I don't do that, but I'm trying to share my thought process in the live stream here. So we have collapsed it a little bit. Like it's not as dense, and we could switch this to a switch. We could convert this to a switch statement or some kind of mapper helper method or something along those lines. And again, this might even end up being a factory. We don't know yet. But the point is, even this response object alone has helped with the nested code and helped make the code more expressive instead of like, again, very kind of sequential and procedural and like these really low-level objects of all these like temp variables. And ideally, I'm going to be able to remove these, but PHP Storm's not showing them grayed out yet, which means I'm still using them somewhere else in the code. So I want to leave myself enough breadcrumbs to come back here. But for now, I've kind of generated the stubs that I want. And again, I think in true TDD fashion, we wouldn't even have gone this far. But since I'm kind of backfilling this object, I think it's an okay leap to kind of do that. But let's get side by side back to testing, and let's drive some of these out, see if we can clean up some of this nested code and kind of make all this work, right? So, okay, let's do this. Let's start with something pretty easy here. So we have this set status, and the status comes in and basically says, okay, store the int value of it, and then if it's a 200, so here's the tricky thing. Some of this logic that's happening in here, and one of the reasons I have some of these if-else statements is because not only am I testing if the object is something, or sorry, if the value is something I want to hold on to, but I also am testing is it in some way is this a default value. So the trick now, let me go back and kind of show you what I mean by that. So, let's say that you had a redirect dashboard, comma 200 right here. So if you had the next parameter of status and you passed in 200, well, 200 is the default. There's no reason for us to tack on a status, arrow status right here at the end of 200 because that's the default, or sorry, 302 in this case for the redirect. Sorry, I thought that said response. So if I had 302 after dashboard and I did a 302 here, there would be no reason for me to kind of set that because it's the default value. So there's more stuff going on underneath the covers here that, okay, is this a 200 for a response? And if it is, then I don't want to set the status. So there's some interesting things is because it's like, okay, do I want to set status to 200 and then this object knows that 200 is the default and so has status returns empty? So there's all sorts of questions I want to answer now that I'm in this object. And so we'll get to answer those through the tests. Just a bit of a tangent there. So get function, let's start with header. I think header's an easy one. So again, I like to build momentum. So let's do test set header. And I know we said we're not going to test headers or getters and setters, but well, header's probably fine. Header probably doesn't need one. So let's do has. Let's do that. Let's do test has header. There we go. And so ideally, if I just have this subject object and I do response parameters, and obviously if I pass in nothing, and I do this, assert false, excuse me, sorry, get a drink here, or sorry, subject has headers. There we go. So this should auto fail, right? Or sorry, auto pass because we don't have any headers. So let's just start testing this, right? Cannot open, oops, I renamed it. There we go. Okay, so we failed. Failed asserting that null is false. Okay, cool. So the simplest thing I could possibly do is just return false here because we've been jumping around the code a lot. So let's actually drive this a little bit more. Okay, so assert false, fine. And now this is why you don't necessarily need to worry about testing your setters because they're basically tested through testing your other things. So let's actually set headers with something in here, right? So let's just, doesn't really matter, x test. And then, yay. Okay, so we set the headers, and now when we call this, it should be false, or sorry, true, that it has headers. And just for giggles, we will set it back to nothing because we can set it as many times as we want, right? And I think this is a fair enough test for such a simple method. So let's do this. Okay, good. And now we have an exception. So value is messed up. And that's because we're assuming that we're passing in an argument here for value. So I never really liked that we're passing an argument. I just kind of did it so the code was clear here. So let's change this to be headers because this thing shouldn't really have a concept of what argument is. If anything, I should just not overload, but I should just add additional parameters, if I need to do something else here. So let's do that. Let's tone this down a bit, and we'll set that to headers. And of course, this needs to be this headers. Cool. Okay, we still have a failure, so failed asserting that false is true. Line 16, that makes sense. Here's line 16. So we're not actually storing it just yet, are we? No, we are. Okay, so we are storing this header. So the setter is correct. We haven't finished this is the problem. So what we want to do down here is pretty straightforward. We just want to return count. What do we have here? So this headers is greater than 0, right? Yay, passing. All right, cool. One down, couple to go. So let's do a couple more of the simple ones, and then we will move on. So let's go back to status because we kind of hinted that that one was a bit harder. So let's do this. Let's say we want to pass in status, and ideally we would want to just say public function has status, and we could change the name of this method, but let's kind of just play this out for a second. So we have subject equals new response parameters. We're not passing anything in. This assert false. So what do we want to do here? So when you don't have a header, well, the simpler thing probably in this case is to say we do have a header. So let's say that assert true on this has status. And what we'll do is end up setting it. So we'll do subject set status, and let's set it to 200. Well, not 200. Let's do 206 for giggles. Okay, let's run that, and everything's passing. Why is everything passing? Because I called it has status. I'm an idiot. It's still a little early for me this morning. There we go. Test has status. I didn't have the right conventions there for my test method name. Okay, so call to undefined method has status. We do have has status. Oh, again, fat-fingered something there. There we go. Failure. Failed asserting that null is true. Okay, so simplest thing we can do is return true. Hey, I'm passing. Well, not really. We just need to write some more tests. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do something a little more interesting. Let's set this to 200. All right. And let's say I want to assert false here. And in fact, we could even assert false a little earlier, like, because we didn't set it right away, right? So we can actually throw a couple different assertions in here. So failed asserting that true is false on line 25. That's what I just pasted. Okay, so we're starting to see some issues here. So let's do this. Let's comment this out because I jumped ahead on a test. So let's just change that out for a second. And let's have this just do something like not is null on status. Whoops, this dot status. All right. So failed asserting that false is true on line 29. Good. Okay, so we got a little farther. It's false by default, so now we're just not setting it. So let's change this to be this status, and same drill. We're just going to put like status code here just to imply that ideally we would like this to be an int val. And I'm going to take this away just for a second. And I want to bring that back, but we'll do that when we uncomment the test. Okay, so we're passing again. Good. All right. So pretty simple here. We'll just set the status, and then we're basically going to say, okay, if status is set, pass it back. So right now we really just have these getters and setters, but here's where we start to get away from that really simple stuff. Let me uncomment, whoops, wrong window. Let me uncomment this test, and we're going to start to drive this beyond just a simple value kind of container now. So let's bring this up. We have a failure on line 33. That's exactly where we wanted. Okay, and it's because now we are a default status, right? We're this 200. So I want to pass back that it's not is null and the status is basically not that 200. It's not the default status, right? So this, what is this? Status is not equal to 200. Cool. And we forgot our ands. Yay. All right, cool. So return not is null on status. So as long as it's not null and it's not 200, then you have a status. You have a non-default status, right? So let's run that, and we are green. Cool. So I want to take a little break here for a second. One, send questions across if you have anything. But I went a little quick there to kind of get past some of these simpler ones because I want to focus on content, and then I think that's where we'll stop for today. So let me recap a couple things here. First of all, we're starting to see that through these really simple methods, we got rid of a lot of those ifs, right? Because basically what we're doing is we're breaking these up into ways that they can still be called using an if statement kind of at that higher level, right? In our fluent thing when we're actually converting your code. Of course, that's going to have if statements, but we're breaking away some of that nesting. Like, you're never going to get away from if statements completely, right? At least not in a language like PHP. Maybe some other languages that are a bit more declarative or so forth, you might be able to get rid of that. But in a scripting language like PHP, it's going to be really hard. I mean, logic just forms the fundamentals of any program. So we're going to have if statements. It's the nesting that bothered me. It's the for each loop with the if else, with the if, just 3 or 4 layers deep is what really bothered me. And again, I talk about this all a lot more in base code, but just kind of at a high level, it's that multiple layering that really bothers me. 1 or 2 layers, guard clauses, expressive helper methods that kind of make it more clear what that big dense if statement used to do is much better in my opinion, much more readable. So we see that not only is it more readable, but also as we go lower, we're not propagating these if statements. We're really just breaking them down into really simple logical expressions. And right now, I mean, this might be considered a little bit complex, but it's still enough for most developers to kind of reason about, right? So we might see that break a little bit as we move towards more content. But the point is that there's an opportunity here to, or sorry, not an opportunity. The object has afforded us the opportunity to really wrap up a lot of these things, but not do it, through simple functions and not do it kind of inline the way the code was doing with temporary variables and these array arguments. It's doing it in a much more kind of expressive API object-oriented way now. So it's very, very, very fun, I think. It makes the code a lot more fun to work with because now, if I have something really cool like this is no content, or if I find something in a future version of Laravel, I can just tack on another check here, drop it in on the other side, and again, not only am I writing the response code, not only am I converting the app's response, functions into more fluent code, but the code that does it is fluent, very, very meta. So anyways, let's move on to one more of these. I think this set content is where it's going to be pretty interesting, and then we can pretty easily drive out is empty and whatnot. So let's get set content, we'll drive out is empty, and then, maybe this is no content. So we're pretty close here. Let's see if we can get just a bit farther. So public function test, what is this? Has content. All right, and pretty similar approach. Subject equals new response parameter. Cool. And right away, of course, we would just kind of almost a sanity check. We would just assert false here. There is no content for this. And obviously we need to actually call our method. My bad. Subject has content. Cool. And that should just auto pass, right? Whoops. Has content has something in it. That's strange. I don't know why has content would have something in it. Okay, failed asserting that null is false, so simplest possible thing, return false. Cool. All right, we're all green. We're all green here. Let's keep going. Whoops. My windows got out of place there. Okay, so let's actually set some content, right? So subject set content. And let's just pass in hello world, right? That's all I can think of right now. Hello world. Cool. And we'll do this, assert true when we call subject has content. Whoops. Okay, so we have illegal string offset. That's happening on line 18 of response parameters, which makes sense because we got a lot of nasty stuff up here. So I am going to leave this in here, but I'm just going to kind of comment it out so we can see it a little bit better. So the simplest thing we're going to do now is we're going to continue to assume, inline symmetrical with our other methods that we're ultimately passing in just this content, right? We're not going to pass in a bunch of other things just yet. We may need to, but for now I'm gonna play it like this is a very simple value object that I'm just setting and getting things, and it's got these helper methods on it, right? So let's play that out until the tests move me somewhere else. So I'm gonna say this content equals content. There we go. Okay, so false, failed asserting that false is true. So I think I still have just the false down here. Yes, I do. So now we can actually do something like empty. So this, or well, you know what? Let's stay strict. Let's stay strict with our is null, right? Until we need another reason. I want this again. I like that symmetry. Something else I talk about in base code, but if I'm doing is null checks and so forth down here, if I'm defaulting stuff to null up top, I want to kind of keep that going. Cool. So let's do that, and we're green. Cool. Okay, so for the very basic bits of content, it seems to work correctly. But let's go back and revisit these comments here and try to get this just a bit farther for a second before we kind of keep crushing some of these easy methods. So what's going on with content here is basically if it's using this helper, like I need to know if content's using a helper, and let's get a real world example of that. I don't think, unfortunately, I have one in this code, but a helper would basically be, let me try to explain it, or you know what, better yet, let's just write it out in the code. So a helper would basically be if inside of here I did something like route, home.index. It's not a very good one, but you get the idea. So that's a route name. So this route is a helper. And that's what the static analysis actually pulls out. So in the abstract syntax tree, I've named that underneath this argument called helper. And that's basically this. And it can be a bunch of other things. It can be action. It can be, all sorts of different things. So route and action are probably the most common, but I'm failing to think of it. But I think there's one more. Actually, you can even put view here. It's not very common, but it's actually allowed. There would be no reason to do that, but you can do that is the point. So anyway, so there are a couple different helpers here. And these helpers, again, as we can see with view and so forth, are kind of ways to do that. So what I want to do is, again, I don't want to pass in this whole argument. I want to make it, this object gives me a way to, again, formalize, all these parameters and what they are, right? And we can formalize it in the name, we can formalize it in the properties, and we can even formalize it in the methods and the arguments themselves. So what we could do is something like, we could say, like, uses view or something like that here, and it's just an optional parameter that's false, right? So, or like is view or something like that. And then that would allow us to not have to do this argument. So let's play this out. That shouldn't affect our current tests. Good. But now we need to kind of drive this out. So test has content. And didn't we have like a view method, is view method? Maybe I forgot to generate that. But I think I remember we said something like is view method. So this is actually perfect. So we could test that out a different way. For right now, though, I am going to test this out using something else. So let's say something, well, we don't have that other method. I'm going to stuff it in here for now. I'm going to break it out later. So let's do this. Let's do this assert false when I actually set the content. So subject has content. But what I want to do is I actually want to pass in subject equals, sorry, subject set content is going to be view, or well, let's make this somewhat real. So let's call this view helper or something, helper, and then view data. All right, and let's say true here. And so the interesting thing with isView is I actually don't want to store this in content. That's kind of what I'm driving at here. So this should fail because it does have content that got set. So this is going to drive me to basically say if isView, then I don't want to set the content. I want to do something else. Now we don't have tests for this yet, but the point is I want to do something else. And then I don't want to say an else here. So for now, let's just flop this. Whoops. Let's flop this, and we'll go up here. And we will do this stuff. So we're going to do this stuff down here. That's kind of a to-do, because again, I might not get to this on the live stream, but let's just see if this is actually going to slow us down. So if it's not a view, then I want to store the content. Failed asserting that true is false, line 48. What did I break? So we have this helper data. View is true. So if not, oh, it still has content from before. So this is actually a good thing I wanted to mention a minute ago. This actually demonstrates one of the reasons you kind of don't want to kind of do multiple assertions in one test, especially like a real simple test like this. And in fact, I was getting ready to kind of put these elsewhere, but I tacked it on here for kind of the speed of things. But it's actually because this hello world happened. So let me just kind of prove that. So yeah, so everything's green now. So because of that hello world, I actually have it set, and then it doesn't get unset down here. So it's kind of interesting. So how can I get around this? I could put this in another test, right? And that kind of alleviates the problem. But this is actually, that's actually a pretty interesting use case that I don't want to forget about testing in the past or in the future, I guess. So I don't want to forget that little kind of potential bug there that like, oh, I did call set content, but it was just kind of an implementation detail that it actually didn't overwrite content, even though it probably will here eventually. So what I'm going to do is actually just change this to say else, and I'm just going to default this back. Because again, this is what makes my current tests pass, and that's all I'm armed with right now. So failed asserting that true is false. So, oops, I just had the same thing here. So if it is a view, then for right now, because there are no other tests, I just want to say null, and we're green. Okay, so basically if you pass in content and you haven't said that it's a view, then it sets content. Otherwise, if it is, it just kind of keeps it default, because we don't have any other tests to say what to do with view yet. So, okay, let me test one more thing, and then we're going to wrap it up. I'll kind of leave us with where I'm going to continue going with this, and I'll probably put this up on a gist later or something so we can kind of see the final bit, but it's going to take well over an hour to kind of finish out the rest of this and clean up the front side of the code. But for now, we can drive out the remaining methods we have, and then I'll kind of go back and add the rest, and that's what I'll end up sharing. So let's do is empty, and we'll go ahead and do is no content just for giggles. So let's do subject equals new response parameters, and we'll say something like this, assert true on subject is empty. Cool, all right. And then we'll basically say something like, let's test this first. Boop. All right, failed asserting that null is true. Well, just return true then. All right, so it is empty. And then we can do something like subject set content. can basically say subject, oops, set content, content. And we'll assert false. Pretty straightforward. Cool. And we can do something down here. Mouse, come on. So now we can say something like, this has content. Failed asserting that false is true. So return, not has content. See, aren't tests great? There we go. Cool. Okay. And we're going to end up in that same problem that we did before with setting response parameters and then kind of overriding it. So I'm actually going to break these out. Be a good kid here. So let's break these out. So test is empty. So that's just the basic test for is empty. And let's test another one. So test is empty returns, or let's do this. Test is not empty when has content, and that just kind of hints towards the bit there. So let's do that. Cool. All right, and I'm just going to copy paste these because you get the idea. We're going to do this for status, and we're going to do this for a bunch of other things. So we can say something like when has status, and we'll say this here is 299, whatever it is. It's not a real status. That's okay. Status. All right, we got a problem here. I've got that duplicate. So when has headers. Cool. And we'll change this to be some kind of header. So x test is not empty. And we will change this to set header. Cool. Okay, so we're failing, good, that makes sense. So I'm not going to be able to do something like, you can't really trick this and basically just say something like, change this to has status, right? Because then one's going to fail and then not the other, and it just starts to get a little weird. So these are good enough tests to start doing something here and chaining it. So basically, if there's not content and there's not a status, oops, has status. That's actually an interesting point though. Let me come back to that. This has headers. Yay! All right, cool. So we're all green again. Jumped ahead a bit. Let me mention something here though. What if I did something like I was a new developer and I came back, new to the code developer, not just a new developer, but I was new to this code and I came back and I wasn't paying attention and maybe just did something like this. Like I didn't dog food my own internal methods. Like, would this still pass? No, it doesn't. So test is empty. Oh, sorry. I have the wrong logic. So it would pass. So this is where it gets interesting because is empty is going to need to be, you're going to have enough test coverage for something like is empty to drive you to make sure that you're doing the right stuff, right? Because what if, similarly, like let's put this back just for now. But similarly over here, if I did something like, status is null, but I passed in the 200, right? Well, you don't really have a status because it's a default status. Like, so technically you are an empty kind of thing, right? But this test isn't going to catch that. I'm still going to pass, right? I changed this to 200 real quick. So there's a couple things here. You would want to drive the tests out. I'm going to kind of end on this note. You want to drive the tests out to make sure that this class is behaving the way that you want it to behave. And what I mean by that is, well, what does it really mean to be empty, right? Does it mean that these are truly null? In which case this is probably the correct bit. But then they don't really follow the logic that's down here, right, on has status, because you could have a status, it is 200, but it's just kind of the default status. So, maybe that lends to something. You'll have to make this choice. This is kind of up to you as a developer. And again, I'll share what I end up finally deciding here in some kind of gist, but maybe that's, something like has default status, right? Maybe I add additional helper methods that do something, like this, right? That'll say something like, oh, okay, you do have a status, right? It's just the default status. So again, it's all about how I want this code to behave. And the way I want this code to behave is to basically tell me from a response parameters perspective what is customized. That's the way I'm writing this class to be. And so if I'm writing the class to be that way, then isEmpty should return true when you have nothing in there, or you don't have anything that's customized in there. So, and again, I could also change the wording to this, something like has custom values or something, right? So, and again, I might end up getting there as I continue to drive this class out, and as I continue to start using the class on the other side. That's really when I start naming things differently. And we kind of saw that before. Like in the beginning, I'll just kind of use a name for whatever I'm calling this thing. But we saw already, like as soon as I started writing the test, like I changed this to response parameter. And it might even be something else, right, by the time I'm done. So again, I'll share all this. Send over your questions now if you have them. So I'll take any kind of final points while I'm just kind of blabbering and grabbing a drink. I know there's a bit of a delay, but that's my goal. My goal is basically to continue driving this out, refactoring along the way, armed with the tests. Should be a pretty easy street on that. And then once I have that, I'll basically be able to go back. Oops, where was I? That was a fluent response. Yeah, that was fluent response. Here it is. Yeah. So once I start to have those things, now it's going to be an opportunity to, we already know that I'm going to have to go back here and change this to things like, argument value. So right now I'm writing the API that I want. I'm writing this response parameters object to be the way I want. I want it to be something that represents very easily for me to just give it this data as I'm kind of looping over and cleaning up, or kind of as I'm looping over the syntax tree. I kind of build out this response parameters object. And once I have that, I can very easily start asking it really simple human questions like, do you have content? And is there a possibility to have, use the no content or something like that? And this may need to be a different method name because as I'm reading it, it's a little confusing. And that's the point. The point is that I'm going to build it the way I want it at the lowest level. I'm going to bring it up to the higher level, and that's where I'm going to start giving it some more human elements, right? I'm going to give it better naming. I'm going to possibly add some more helper methods. But functionally, at its core, I think we've exemplified a way to get around that nested code, in this case by introducing an object, because that's what this code was. At the end of the day, this code was really a way to store a bunch of temporary variables by just basically a switch statement or a nested if statement or whatever you want to call it. We would just loop over and build those up. And so we could even go so far as to kind of build that up again with another helper method, a mapper or a factory or something that we say, here's a bunch of arguments, give me back a response parameters object. And we could do that, but since I'm already looping over these anyways to kind of clean up some stuff, I don't think it's the end of the world to just kind of leave that code right here for now. This is much cleaner than it was. So anyway, thank you all for joining live. Looks like we got a few extra people come in along the way. Like I said, I'll edit the intro out of this. I'll add that title per Bernardo's suggestion. Good suggestion. And in the future, I will try to have this link posted earlier in the morning. That way, people we can stick to a little bit of a better schedule. So, if you have any ideas for refactoring that you want to see, let me know. I'm doing lots of different code during the week. So it's one of those things where, maybe as I stumble upon that type of code, I'll keep that fresh in my head. But this is one I kind of glossed over early in the week, and we kind of did it together. So maybe not as well prepared today as far as seeing the final result, but I think you can see the direction we're heading in, and hopefully it gives you some ideas on how to clean up nested code. See you all next time.